Alright, so today I want to discuss a topic that isn't just pertinent to rock-afire, but is also pertinent to anyone who makes molds or latex masks for props, movies, or just about anything. So what I want to discuss today is the importance of having a master mold and the purpose they serve. And then I'll also discuss what can happen if you don't have a master mold. Now, one thing I'll mention is that if you're using urethane or silicone to make masks, this isn't going to apply as much, but you should still watch and learn. So, to start off, a master mold is really just a designation for a mold and how it's used. A master is taken off of a clay sculpture or a positive of some kind, and the mold can be made of any kind of mold-making material, but ideally it will be made of fiberglass, plastic, urethane rubber, or silicone. Now, the reason materials like these are used specifically for masters is because they will stand up to the test of time. They're going to perfectly retain the detail of the sculpture or positive, and you could lay up 1,000 masks in, for example, a fiberglass mold and not lose any detail. The only real issues you could encounter with these molds is if you were to scratch them, or in the case of a rubber mold, you could tear it somehow. So then the question becomes, why not just lay up masks in the master mold if they really aren't going to lose detail over time? Well, as I said, this video is specifically to discuss latex masks, and in order for latex to set up, the water has to be absorbed out of it or it has to evaporate out. A fiberglass mold is not porous, and it's not going to absorb any water, so the water in the latex actually has to evaporate out of it. You actually have to paint on layers of latex. Very thin layers over the course of a week or two. You may do 10, 15 layers in the fiberglass mold to actually get a mask that is of a reasonable thickness. So clearly it's not very time effective to make the masks in the fiberglass mold. So what you do instead is you make a plug in the fiberglass mold. This requires just laying up a very thin layer of rubber in the mold to capture all the detail, and then you fill that with foam or some other material to help keep the shape and stability. You will then take that plug and make a plaster mold off of it. That is what you will use to make the latex masks. You can actually make several molds with that same plug as long as you don't damage it. So great, now you have a plaster mold that you can easily lay up a latex mask in. You can just throw out the master now, right? I personally wouldn't recommend that. Plaster is great for laying up latex masks because it is porous and soft. It absorbs the water right out of the latex, and you can get a thick skin in just 3 hours. But what makes it great for latex is also its downfall. It's soft and porous. Every cast you make in a plaster mold degrades it. A new mask, if you look at it, will have a thin layer of plaster on it from the mold. So you can imagine over time the mold is going to get worse and worse to the point where you lose details. Now for most people, the hobbyists, they aren't going to be worrying about that because they aren't laying up enough masks to the point where that will be an issue. So this is really only going to affect people who are doing masks that are going to be mass produced. So now the rock-afire explosion comes into play. Some people are under the impression that creative engineering made a plaster mold of the original sculpture and then just had one mold for each character face or latex piece. And that is not correct. During production, for example, January of 1983, they were producing 50 shows that quarter, and in order to keep up, they couldn't just have one mold of each. They had 10 to 15 for each character, and they were able to do this by the process I discuss. They made a fiberglass master mold of the sculpture, then they made a plug, and then they used that plug to make all the plaster molds that they needed. Now, not all master molds they produced were fiberglass. Some were plastic, and some were actually urethane. Now, when they moved out of the production plant in 1987, they destroyed most of the plaster molds. They kept 3 molds of each character and brought those back to the Jefferson Building. They continued to use these molds to make masks for showbiz locations and later the family entertainment centers. Due to these molds being used, I would assume hundreds of times, they became very degraded. No one noticed, not employees in the 90s, and I don't really blame them because it's a gradual process and you aren't really going to notice unless you compare the first cast you ever made with one of the newer masks. But me and my friend were actually, I would say, the first people to notice this when we were comparing some old showbiz masks to the current masks, and we realized that they were missing a lot of detail. In the case of Fats, who I believe is the best example, he was missing almost all the fine detail in his face, and he actually was missing his teeth. So we thought this was very interesting, and it was also around the time when we were curious what fiberglass molds were used for, because at that time no one knew why they were there. Luckily, Aaron saved the master molds. So working with Aaron, new molds were produced using the same process they did in the 1980s, and the result was beautiful new molds that produced perfectly detailed masks. If you didn't make a master mold and 50 masks down the line you want that detail back, I'm afraid you're out of luck. And if you didn't make a master mold and you accidentally drop your plaster mold, again, you're out of luck. And if you want to make multiple molds and have no master, that's also going to be more complicated. It's great that the master molds for the rock-afire still exist and existed so that we could actually bring the detail back. So if you want one of these masks, you can contact Aaron at his email and order one. They're very beautiful, and even if you don't have a character, they would make great display pieces.